An island known as Sumbawa, with large mountains, beautiful blue-green water, and a flourishing society, was destroyed by a volcano which was considered the highest point in Indonesia in a matter of hours. The island Sumbawa has been inhabited since prehistoric times. During its development, the settlers utilized the island's resources to improve their abilities to hunt and survive. Rock paintings discovered by researchers depicted the early agricultural systems, hunting tactics, and crop cultivation. The inhabitants of Sumbawa experienced influences from multiple cultures and religions as their civilization expanded over time. Buddhist and Hindu religions spread throughout Indonesia, impacting the inhabitants at Sumbawa. Early royal hierarchies began to form on the island, known as the Dharmasraya Kingdom, that influenced the population with political and religious ordinances. Because of these early influences, the island of Sumbawa expanded their political and overarching social systems. During the 14th and 16th centuries, Islamic royalty used their power to grow the Islamic learning and culture of the population, which eventually influenced the academics and bartering that would take place throughout the following centuries. Throughout the development of Sumbawa society, two major sultanates, ruling groups of territory typically aligned with Islamic beliefs, reigned over the population. The Sultanate of Bima and the Sultanate of Sumbawa maintained a balance of power in the east and western areas of the island of Sumbawa. That was, until the early 17th century when the Dutch East India Company began to establish a monopoly on the trades of Sumbawa. Eventually, the Dutch East India Company signed treaties with the Sultanates, allowing the company to create trading posts and forts. Although this was a lucrative opportunity for inhabitants of Sumbawa to receive more fruitful materials and resources, the Dutch influence eventually overtook the Sultanate ruling powers by exploiting the two powers and pitting them against one another. By doing so, the Dutch influence expanded and further influenced the political systems of Indonesia. Centuries after Sumbawa had developed a civilization of political systems, trading posts, and thriving individuals, a single, disastrous event destroyed all that the society of Sumbawa had ever known. Early April of 1812 is when the volcano, Mount Tambora, began to rumble. 3 years later, it erupted. On April 5, 1815, Mount Tambora released the deafening sounds of detonation in a mild eruption. The sounds of the volcano could be heard over 1,500 miles away on the neighboring island of Sumatra. The Sumbawa inhabitants were terrified, but had no idea the extreme destruction of Mount Tambora they would face in the following days. Around 7 p.m. on the 10th of April, the continued eruptions intensified. 3 clouds of ash, also known as plumes, emerged from Mount Tambora and merged together. Volcanic rock almost 8 inches large rained down on the people, followed by ash an hour later. When the eruption cloud caved in, hot ash and lava poured down the mountainsides at over 100 miles per hour, heading towards the sea and consuming everything in its path. The devastation of homes, animals, vegetation, and people had instantly followed. 100,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of Mount Tambora's eruption. The loud explosions continued through the next evening, spreading across the island of Sumbawa. The island of Sumbawa was forever changed after the devastation. Mount Tambora itself was also altered after its explosion, approximately 9,000 feet post-eruption, compared to the 14,000 it stood at previously. It left an indent in the earth, also known as a caldera, almost 4.3 miles wide and 3,000 feet deep, and ash had continued to fall from the sky for weeks after. Those who had survived the ruin of Mount Tambora were left with contaminated water sources in falling groups. The gases released from the volcano's eruption caused lung infections in the surviving island inhabitants. Many who had survived the initial emission of volcanic lava and gases eventually also passed, due to the starvation and disease initiated by the aftermath. When the catastrophe had eventually calmed, the governor of Java sent a representative to Sumbawa to report on the remnants of the eruption. The representative, a lieutenant named Phillips from Java, was horrified when he arrived, finding dead bodies, villages deserted, and most homes collapsed into mere rubble. The few survivors of the explosion had been searching for clean food and water, but came up unlucky. The water and food found had been contaminated by the ash, causing a violent epidemic of diarrhea in those who had survived. Upon seeing the once beautiful Sumbawan ruins, Lieutenant Phillips commented, "On my trip towards the western part of the island, the extreme misery to which the inhabitants have been reduced is shocking to behold. There were still on the roadside the remains of several corpses, and the marks of where many others have been interred. The village is almost entirely deserted and the house has fallen down, the surviving inhabitants having dispersed in search of food. Since the eruption, A violent diarrhea has prevailed in Bima, Dampo, and Sangir, which has carried off a great number of people. It is supposed by the natives to have been caused by drinking water, which has been impregnated with ashes, and horses have also died, in great numbers, from a similar complaint. The effects of the Mount Tambora explosions carried on for years to come. A tsunami with a height of 13 feet in late April is believed to have been caused by the mountain's eruption, killing another 4,600 residents of Sumbawa Island. Explosions continued months after the initial destructive eruption, and smoke emissions continued through later that year. During October of 1815, British ships were stalled due to pumice rafts found west of the island. Even after 4 years had passed since the initial eruption, flames and aftershocks were still occurring on Sumbawa. Although the volcanic eruption had occurred on an island in Indonesia, the initial explosion had effects on other areas around the world. The ash, pumice, and gas in the Earth's atmosphere had meant less sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth, leading to a change in temperatures around the world. The global temperature in 1816 had cooled by 0.95 degrees Fahrenheit. Although this slight change may not seem significant to some, it indirectly caused the deaths of 90,000 people around the world. In the northeastern part of the United States, a persistent dry fog was released and consistent, dimming the sunlight and making the air difficult to breathe. Countries in the northern hemisphere were faced with extreme weather conditions, facing colder temperatures that lasted months and destroyed crops and the livelihood of farmers. Snow was actually reported in New York and Maine in June. These shifts in climate, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, also disrupted the Indian monsoon and contributed to the spread of cholera in Bengal. Famine spread throughout the world because of the scarcity of the crops, and those in England and Ireland were left starving because of the heavy reliance on wheat, oat, and potato harvests. Food prices skyrocketed in Germany, and citizens eventually began rioting and looting to survive. This period was considered the worst famine of the 19th century, all directly related to the deadliest volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora. In 2004, excavators actually visited the ruins of a village in Sumbawa known as Tambora in Indonesia to gain an understanding of and study the culture. During the dig spanning 6 weeks' time, the archaeological team discovered a lost culture that had been devastated by the eruption of Mount Tambora. The team cut through 10 feet of volcanic pumice and found remnants of a small family in a house, 2 adults, bowls, pots, and other artifacts. The volcano today is still considered alive, since the 18th century eruption. Since the initial explosion, there have been 3 dates recorded of activity within the area. In 1819 and 1880, there were eruptions detailed to be a 2 on the VEI, Volcanic Explosivity Index. On a scale of 0 through 8, 8 being the largest eruption, a 2 is considered dangerous, but nowhere near what Sumbawa had faced in the early 1800s. The third and last recorded eruption occurred in 1967, over 50 years ago, but was rated a 0 on the VEI scale due to the fact that it only had minimal lava flow in a central eruption. There are currently almost 2 million people inhabiting the island of Sumbawa today. The island is still haunted by the history of the Mount Tambora eruption, but has been able to develop a successful and functioning society with even tourism numbers growing. The citizens of Sumbawa have an industrious agricultural system, growing corn, beans, coffee, cultivating rice, and raising animals for export. The lasting impacts of Mount Tambora's eruption have been seen over time all around the world. No other volcanic eruption has caused even half of the devastation of Mount Tambora. The people of Sumbawa have been able to recreate the livelihood they once knew, but Mount Tambora will forever cast its blazing shadow in Indonesia.